And the foods that the two vegetarians that the government commissioned to write various bits of pamphlets and books came up with were really impractical. So one of the things that they suggested was that people should cook with the existing meat substitutes that were around. Things like nutter, which is the best name for a product ever, and is, as you would imagine, nut butter. But by 1916, you couldn't get hold of meat substitutes. The Nutter factory had become a factory making guns. So much of the advice given in the First World War really did fall on ears of people who said, what on earth are you talking about? And there were a few cookbooks written by people like May Byron, who's a children's author and a biographer in the 19th century. She goes on to write cookbooks where she points out that the government really doesn't know what it's talking about. She does. And she says there is no excuse for not keeping standards up as well. And that you should still strive to have 3 courses at any main meal, and certainly if you're inviting people over, you should still attempt to have soup, a main dish involving meat or fish, and some form of carbohydrated vegetable, and a pudding. And you see that again in the Second World War, that people, they get quite reliant on sugar and biscuits, and I don't think it would be much of an exaggeration to say that the Second World War was partly fought on biscuits on the home front. Because a cake or a biscuit, very, very small amounts thereof, obviously, but that gives you hope, it gives you a luxury, it gives you something you don't need. Who takes tea with sugar these days, sugar in their tea? 5 of you. If I'd asked that question in 1940, you would all have taken sugar in your tea. And we just don't do it. We think it's unhealthy, we don't like the taste anymore. We've just changed. But it would be unthinkable, really, to go without sugar in your tea if you could possibly help it in the Second World War. Lots of people had to, obviously. But the point is that how we regard food has changed. And as you just heard, if you're doing a very physical job, if you have a physical lifestyle, you can kind of eat with alacrity. You can go out and pretty much eat almost what you want to, and it's okay. We are so sedentary now. And how we regard food has changed an awful lot. That said, the recipes I'm cooking are from the early part of the Second World War, but a lot of the recipes that were recycled in the Second World War were also Great War recipes, and indeed they were Victorian poverty cooking before that. So although we think of rationing food as being something that's very particular, in some cases it was, a lot of the time it's just common sense. I'm going to do potato cake, that's my dessert, so my 2-course meal is a potato cake, because potatoes, they're brilliant, they replace flour, they're starchy, they stick things together, absolutely fab recipe, and then a fish roe curry, because I've got a bit of pre-war spice left over in the back of my cupboard, so that's great. Who's eaten fish roe before? One person. Sushi. Fish roe is the egg sack. Yes, actually, caviar counts. But mine is cod roe, which, as you can see, looks incredibly unappetising. So what I'm going to do is I'll cook and I'll talk through what I'm doing and what else I've got on the table. It's really good, by the way, fried, but since there's a shortage of fat in the war, I've boiled it. On the other side of the table over there, you've got what is effectively the weekly ration. So if you want to visualise what you've got, you can see it's not a great deal. The marmalade is the monthly ration. You get a choice of marmalade, preserves, or sugar to make your own jam. And then the sweets as well, that's again a monthly ration. And you might think it's curious to have sweets, but of course again this is something that will get you through. And if you think about the harsh reality of being stuck in an Anderson shelter with bombs falling around you, most of the advice says take chocolate, because it will get you through it. The government in the Second World War is much, much better at putting out decent advice, because it commissions food writers who exist and who are already household names in the 30s to come and give advice to people. So people like Ambrose Heath, who's already a known food figure. He does a series of radio programmes, The Kitchen Front, which are absolutely phenomenal and very, very well known and very, very good. And the advice that is given out, generally speaking, in the Second World War is quite good. Many of the things you hear about that are not so good, like trying to put paraffin in cakes instead of oil, probably didn't happen or may have happened once or twice. So generally speaking, food policy in the Second World War and the advice given out is much, much better. But we now get to test the induction hob to see if it works. Here is my potato. In this case, I have utilised the heat left over from my fire because it's cold outside. Fuel is rationed as well, so I'm not going to light an oven just to bake potato. So all I've done is I've stuck it in the ashes of my fire. I don't want to waste the peel, so I'll probably either grind that up and feed it to the pig that I keep outside, or perhaps I might just mash it up and put it in a salad. But for the purposes of the cake, the peel gets in the way of grating it, so I'm not going to bother with that. And the recipes, as all recipes do, always have amounts attached to them. But you tend to find, at least at the beginning of the war, that knowledge of cooking is somewhat better than it is today. So I always take the amounts as a bit of a sort of guideline, really. One of the things that I would argue that the Second World War and the 14 years of rationing does for the country is basically eradicate British cuisine. Because, of course, if you are learning to cook when your ingredients are restricted and your food is restricted and your fuel is restricted, you're not necessarily going to learn to cook the most brilliant dishes. And then we go on and we reach the 50s and the 60s. Of course, we have a great wave of frozen foods eventually, and we have ready meals and convenience foods start to come in. And we never really recover the level of knowledge that we had in the 30s. So I'm ricing my potato, which makes it into sort of a substitute flour, which is effectively what it is in this recipe. Actually, I might take some off that. Flour at this point is usually sieved still. You don't need to sieve modern flour, as I suspect most of you know, because there are very few weevils in it, caterpillars, bits of soot, ash, dried bits, things that fell off the ceiling, all those things, not usually in modern flour, which obviously is nice, but often in flour in the past. If you read historic cookbooks up to really the 30s, most of them will say things like keep your flour by the fire, dry out your flour, dry out your sugar, because if you're keeping it in damp storerooms, you usually find it clumps together. And flour does often have weevils, and it's not inedible with weevils or caterpillars in it if you take them out, hence the sieve. So I'll remove all the caterpillars from my flour. And in the war as well, another thing you see really catch on, which I think is really quite a new thing in many ways, is the use of baking powder. Who bakes cakes regularly? Do you rely on raising agents? Has anyone ever done a cake without raising agents that isn't a rich fruit cake? Okay, pre-1850, no raising agents at all. Cakes risen purely with eggs. Pre-1600, no cakes risen with anything, because they're all yeasted, they're just sort of effectively bread doughs. So raising agents come in the 1850s and they're distrusted, because if you're a decent cook, you shouldn't have to rely on a raising agent. What you find during the Second World War, and indeed the First World War, is because of the egg shortage, you can't rise your cakes with egg anymore, and you have to rely on baking powder. So our modern reliance on baking soda, on bicarbonate, on cream of tartar, on all of the raising agents that you would normally add to cakes today comes completely, really, from the Second World War. Again, devaluation of cookery. Go home, throw out your raising agents. You don't need them. Absolutely no point in them. So that's flour with raising agent added, either self-raising flour or plain flour with an actual agent added. I always think if you're going to cook, then do as your grandmother would have done and buy plain flour and a separate raising agent, because self-raising flour, the raising agent goes off after about a year, so it's largely pointless. We're using a very small amount of margarine. We tend to find people who grew up or learned to cook during the Second World War are totally reliant on margarine and make their cakes with margarine, not butter. Personally, I loathe the stuff from the depths of my being. I grew up on it spread on toast. It is vile. There is no room in anyone's world for margarine. But this is the war. And you can see there's 1 ounce of margarine in these cakes. The cakes, they doesn't make a huge cake, this either. The point about wartime cakes is they are a luxury. You don't make huge ones, and they don't have a lot of ingredients in. So I'm going to cream 1 ounce of margarine, 1 ounce of sugar, and a very tiny bit of marmalade. One of the reasons you get quite a lot of marmalade is because of in the First World War at least, because of the fact that people get a lemon juice or lime juice ration. So the peels that are left back here get used for marmalade. So you get this very low-grade marmalade, especially in the Great War. But the marmalade in this adds flavour, adds sweetness, because of course there's quite a lot of sugar in there, and adds moisture, because there's not a lot going in this otherwise. So I will give margarine the fact that it's a lot easier to cream than butter, but I think that's probably outweighed by the fact it's vile. Creamed and mixed. Wartime cookery is great. It takes seconds. Because if you've got no ingredients and no fuel and no time, you don't have a lot of choice. So in goes this. And because of the fact that, again, this is cookery where you don't want to waste what's in the bowl. These days we just stick that in the dishwasher and forget about it. But I don't want to do that. So once I've mixed this in, I'm going to pour it into this bowl to get rid of all the fat that I've got there. fat is one of the things that people really do talk about a lot during the Second World War. And you find that fat and sugar, and to some extent red meat, but especially fat and sugar, are the things that people really get obsessed about as well. So if you read the diaries and the letters home, especially of POWs, you tend to find that they're constantly dreaming about sugar and fat. People will lie awake at night in a prisoner of war camp and dream about chocolate bars. And they are constantly obsessing about food. It becomes this kind of overarching obsession. And it's always sugary goods. It's patisserie. If they're French, it's patisserie. If they're British, then it's custard buns and iced tarts. You know, whichever culture people are from, it is the sweet stuff of that culture that they're dreaming about constantly, along with steak to some extent. But again, a lot of that is because of the fat content. So you can see I'm getting out as much as I can do simply by mixing it with my dry ingredients. No wastage at all. And if I've got a dog, I'll probably use that as the dog's bowl afterwards, so that the dog is also getting some fat, so that absolutely nothing ends up in the sink. I've also got a bit of dried fruit, and these are all things where at the beginning of the war you may well have stockpiles of things. You may well have things that you just got left over. I'm sure if war broke out tomorrow, many of you would have spices in the back of your cupboards, dried fruit that you bought for that Christmas cake you never got round to making, bits of gelatin, you know, all sorts of bits and pieces. But once war starts to really bite, these things become in short supply. So it's not a lot of dried fruit, really. And again, it may well be that you're lucky enough to have a garden and you can supplement your dried fruit with something from your garden. When you look at the ration over there, the one thing that's missing, obviously, is fresh fruit and vegetables. And I take it as read that if you've got access to a garden, you'll be growing as much as you can do. But many people didn't and couldn't and didn't have access to gardens or didn't want to garden or felt they shouldn't have to. So although the Dig for Victory campaign was absolutely massive, it's becoming increasingly obvious that there was a level of weariness with it, certainly by the end. So I've got a fairly wet dough there, mainly because of my vigorous creaming situation, I think. And this needs to be cut into rondelles and fried, which is why I put my margarine on greaseproof paper, because fat's in such short supply that is my fat to fry my potato cakes in. And you can do this on a griddle as well. Marvellous. That was it being switched on, wasn't it? Yeah. I do have one, but it's not quite this model. Right, again I can spot some bits of fat that I can use in there. Flour and bread, or bread especially, was unrationed along with potatoes, but as you've already heard, the bread became so sort of black and grim that people did actually go quite a long way to avoid it. And if you didn't have flour, you would use flour substitutes, cornstarch, anything that you could find, really. But you can see what you've got here is effectively mashed potato with a little bit of sugar and jam and some dried fruit, a very little amount of dried fruit. So perhaps not the most appetising thing in the world, I would say, but there's a war on. And actually, in many ways, this recipe is not dissimilar to 18th and 19th century potato puddings that you would get. When potatoes first came into the country, no one was quite sure how to eat them. No one was quite sure whether or not they would cause leprosy either, but that was a different issue. And you used to find that they were sweetened and put into pastry. And actually, if you divorce yourself of your modern preconceptions about potato being essentially savoury, they work quite well like that. But unfortunately, I find that we're more and more blinkered in the modern world as to what things should be used for. So we do tend to divide things into sweet and savoury more than perhaps they should be. There's no intrinsic reason you can't add sugar to a potato, apart from the fact that today we would much prefer to roast them. But you can't really do that because of the shortage of fuel, the shortage of fat, all the rest of it. those are my potato cakes, and I probably will set off fire alarm any minute now. So I'm going to do a very unwarlike thing, and I'm going to add some more fat to it. I wouldn't care about the smoke if I was living in a pre-smoke alarm house, but I do feel that probably having the entire St Mary's evacuated would probably be quite a bad idea. So, some butter, shall we? Turn it down. I don't have that much fat, I didn't just do that, but nicely crisped. It's the problem with having no fat. But that's alright, you can take that bit off. I'm afraid the induction hob is a little bit fiercer than I thought, sorry about that. I love it when you fuse things by mistake. But the fire alarm's not going off, right? So we're all right. Yeah. It probably wouldn't be this burnt had I turned it right down to 2 to start off with. It's the problem with using induction hobs over cast iron stoves. If it gets too hot on a cast iron stove, you simply move it. But never mind. You can just eat from the other side. The bit where I did put some fat in. You can see they're doughy, but they do stick together fairly well. And all of this is quite good because it does mean that if I've got a fire for heating, and don't forget at this point most heating is still coal fires, then I can put my frying pan over my fire and I don't have to light the range in my kitchen. Ranges are not particularly efficient when it comes to cooking, so it is much, much better if you can to cook over whatever available heat source that you've got. And you find a real rise in things like hay box cookery as well. Why are you hating me? Where you simply heat the stew up to the point where it's boiling and stick it in a large box full of hay. This is invented by the Victorians. Just let it do its thing. Yeah, it's right. If there's a bang and there's like smoke everywhere, then it means they've blown it up. But let's not even think about the possibility of that, shall we? Right. While those are cooking, I'm going to cook my cod's roe curry, but I'm also going to use this. I don't know if any of you have seen one of these before. It's appalling. It's the most useless invention ever, apart from possibly what's the latest thing? The Spyro. That thing, yes, yeah, that. There have been funky ways to cut your vegetables up for a very long time. It's basically the 1970s given a re-health branding.